February 2012 marks 200 years since the birth of Charles Dickens, and the bicentenary is going to be marked by festivals and special events all around the world. Also by a huge number of new publications and studies about one of the finest and most prolific writers in the English language. My personal birthday present to Dickens is my new novel, a murder mystery inspired by what I think is his masterpiece, Bleak House. Bleak House is Dickens at the peak of his powers. It's a wonderful, gripping story, it's a biting social commentary, and it's a vast panorama of 19th century London, from the highest in the land to the lowest and meanest living on the streets. Now, if you know your Charles Dickens quite well, you'll also know that that was a title that he came to quite late in the day. He had several others in mind as he was writing the book. One of these was The Solitary House, which is the title of my book in North America. And another was Tom All Alones, which is the title of my book in the UK. So why Tom All Alones? In Bleak House, Dickens writes about a squalid slum in the centre of London, which he considered to be a symbol of everything that was wrong in British society at the time. It's a miserable tenement with people huddled together, diseases rife, and there's a half-derelict graveyard where some of the secrets of Bleak House turn out to be buried. I've taken this as my inspiration, and the opening scenes of my novel take place in the same slum and at the same rat-infested graveyard. Tom All Alones was never a real place name, but it was a real place, and it was located roughly where I'm standing now, between the Tottenham Court Road and Covent Garden. There's no slum here now, and the graveyard Dickens talked about is long gone. But I can still imagine what it might have looked like all those years ago, as I describe it in my book.
No one but a fool or a foreigner would venture willingly into such a maze of dilapidated houses, seeming blind yet teeming behind with a desperate human detritus that has no choice but to call this vile place home. Even the fog seems more malevolent here, funneling down from the main thoroughfare and eddying ghostly into archways and casements. Half a dozen times in as many months, the ground round here has been shaken by a sudden crash as one of these structures has subsided, throwing a tower of dust into the dirty London air. The last was barely 3 weeks before, and when the scavengers moved in to rake the wreckage, they found more than 24 bodies, men, women and children, huddled together for warmth, half naked, in a room less than 15 feet square.
One of the many things I love about Bleak House is that it introduces a completely new genre into English literature. It's the very first detective mystery story. My novel also has a brutal murder at its heart, and I've constructed it so that the events in my story run parallel with those in Bleak House. At certain points, the two stories converge, and we see characters from Dickens' novel in mine, in the crowded dining houses and pubs and omnibuses of the noisy London streets. Some of Dickens' characters also play a more important role in my story, and one obvious example is Inspector Bucket, who is Dickens' detective and based on a real-life man. My own detective is a young man called Charles Maddox, who's been unfairly dismissed from the police by Inspector Bucket himself and is now trying to establish himself as a private detective. Quite early in the novel, he comes to live here, in Buckingham Street, which is just off the Strand, and in 1850 used to run all the way down to the banks of the Thames. The reason he comes here is to be near his elderly great-uncle, and anyone who's read Murder at Mansfield Park will recognise that great-uncle straight away as the original Charles Maddox, the Regency thief-taker who solves the mystery in my first novel. But Maddox is an old man now, and prey to a terrifying disease that his doctors don't understand, and which leaves him perfectly coherent one minute, but erratic and angry the next. But when he is lucid, there's no finer intelligence in London, and no one with a greater understanding of the criminal mind. And young Charles will need all Maddox's insights if he's to solve the terrible secret at the heart of my book. Buckingham Street may still look pretty much as it did in the 19th century, but you certainly can't say the same for where I am now. Seven Dials is now a chic shopping area filled with fashionable restaurants. But in 1850, it was one of the most dangerous areas of London, filled with drinking dens and the haunt of thieves and whores. Charles comes here in the course of his investigation, on the trail of a man who's been sending anonymous and threatening letters to an eminent banker called Sir Julius Cremorne. And who has commissioned Charles to find this man? None other than Mr. Tulkinghorn, the formidable lawyer of Bleak House. In Bleak House, Tulkinghorn lives here, in the centre of London's legal quarter, Lincoln's Inn Fields. Dickens never says which house it is he lives in, but I've chosen to have his home in the building behind me that was once owned by the architect, Sir John Soane. It looks fairly ordinary from the outside, but inside there is no more extraordinary house in London. Soane was an avid collector of antiquities, and he turned his house into a breathtaking private gallery to showcase his enormous collection. The scenes I've set here are some of my favourites in the novel, and I think you'll understand why.
Objects stud every surface, every wall, every shelf, as well as every passage and alcove within view. It is, quite simply, the largest and most extraordinary collection of classical statuary Charles has ever seen. Not even his beloved British Museum can rival this. Stone, marble, terracotta, alabaster, every texture, every colour, from pearly ivory to a rich polished black, funerary urns and a statue of Apollo, horn-eared gods and a snake-haired Medusa, busts of ancient emperors and fragments of vase, heads in profile, heads in relief, tiny broken details mounted on plaques, and perfectly intact slabs of huge architectural frieze. Tulkinghorn leads Charles towards the dome, and now he sees that this space is not a room at all, but a gallery around another, lower chamber that opens now beneath him, half plunged in darkness and dominated by a huge stone trough, throned on pillars and deeply carved with symbols and runes. No, not runes, thinks Charles, leaning over the balustrade as his eyes adjust to the light. Not runes, but hieroglyphs. And it's not a trough, but a sarcophagus. An enormous, perfectly preserved Egyptian sarcophagus.
Dickens says nothing about Tulkinghorn being a collector, but there's nothing in Bleak House to preclude it either. So from my point of view, it was one of those wonderful moments when my imagination could engage directly with his. One of those opportunities to explore some of his most compelling characters and address some of the questions that Bleak House leaves tantalisingly unanswered. So my book is in part a homage to what I think is one of the finest novels ever written. But it's also a story in its own right, with its own characters and its own mystery to solve. So if you've never read Bleak House or any Dickens, it really doesn't matter. Plenty of people have enjoyed my book simply for a good old-fashioned murder mystery, evoking the sights and sounds and smells of 19th century London. So come with me and I'll be your guide to a dark and sinister Victorian underworld that Charles Dickens knew but could only hint at.